Thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. How powerful is a foreign ruler when he is reputed to have sent a letter to the monarch of France, an ally, informing him that this ruler has recently learned that the men and women of France's court are dancing in close proximity to each other, referring to the waltz, and that allies or not, unless France's monarch ends this abomination, he will invade with his armies and raze it to the ground. France complied and banned the waltz. According to the scant record we have of this, the monarch that penned that letter was Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the same sultan that we will experience during the Battle of Vienna.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 29, The Battle of Vienna, the 27th of September through the 14th of October, 1529. Austrian Forces, 16,000 soldiers and 72 cannon. Ottoman Forces, 250,000 soldiers and 300 cannon. The Ottoman defeat at Vienna marked the zenith of their European ambitions, the point where their imperial tide reached its furthest limit. From that moment, the empire's grip on power began a slow, irreversible decline, foreshadowing centuries of retreat and decay.
In the 1520s, Europe stood ripe for conquest. Its rival kingdoms fractured and bleeding from within, much like the ancient turmoil between Byzantium and Persia had once birthed Islam's unstoppable march from Arabia centuries before. Yet it was not merely Europe's fragility that invited its enemies, but the fierce, relentless rivalries that tore it apart. The continent's powerhouses, King Francis I of France and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, clashed ceaselessly for dominance over the Franco-German frontier and the prized lands of northern Italy. France wielded a military machine forged in steel and thunder, its dominance built on devastating artillery and fearsome heavy cavalry, crushing foes in a string of hard-fought victories. Charles, the towering patriarch of the Habsburg dynasty, commanded a vast empire that stretched from Austria to Spain. His armies, built around the fearsome tercio formation, stood unyielding, pikemen locked in impenetrable phalanxes, their ranks bolstered by arquebuses wielding the brutal power of matchlock muskets. Cavalry charges shattered like waves against the rock of these formations. And when the two titans clashed at Pavia in 1525, it was France that lay broken in the dust. King Francis, humiliated and captured, simmered in his chains, plotting revenge with the cold precision of a wounded predator, his mind turning to alliances that might shift the balance of power. Charles, though triumphant on the battlefield, was plagued by Pope Clement VII. The Holy Roman Emperor was meant to be the sword arm of the church, but since Charlemagne's time, the uneasy question of who truly held the reins, emperor or pope, had never been settled. Clement's hatred for Charles festered deeply. Before donning the papal robes, he had been Giulio de' Medici, a man of immense wealth and power, and now he seethed at the emperor's iron grip over Italy. Clement's disdain left Charles isolated, not just politically, but spiritually, as the emperor faced the growing storm of the Protestant Reformation and Martin Luther's rebellious stirrings in Germany without the church's backing. Surrounded by enemies, Charles fought to keep his empire intact, juggling conflicts with Rome, France, and the unruly heart of Central Europe. In Constantinople, Sultan Suleiman, the ninth ruler of the Ottomans, watched this European chaos with the calculating gaze of a predator. He was heir to a dynasty of cunning and devout conquerors, each more ruthless than the last. The empire Suleiman ruled spanned from the Persian frontiers to the sands of Morocco, its might gripping the Balkans in an iron fist. His military force stood as a juggernaut, equal to any army Charles or Francis could muster. Its strength was built on two pillars: elite infantry and devastating artillery. From the time of Sultan Ala ed-Din, Christian families had paid their taxes in blood, offering up their sons to the Ottoman war machine. These boys, stripped of their former lives, were molded into slaves, converted to Islam, and forged from childhood into warriors. They emerged as the Janissaries, an elite brotherhood of soldiers utterly devoted to Islam and their sultan, willing to march into any hell, fight any foe, and never yield. The Ottoman Turks had mastered the European art of casting cannon, but they surpassed their mentors, becoming the undisputed titans of artillery warfare. With colossal cannons, the mightiest the world had ever seen, the Ottomans breached the legendary walls of Constantinople in 1453, toppling a city that had withstood siege for a millennia. Siege warfare became the hallmark of Turkish power, their monstrous cannons reducing city after city to rubble, while the unstoppable Janissaries cut down armies that dared to stand in their path. Though Suleiman was pragmatic and charismatic in diplomacy, enough for European powers to treat with him, he was also the Caliph of all Islam, a mantle he took after Egypt fell and the final spiritual leader was cast aside. Bound by his faith, Suleiman was charged with the sacred mission to spread Islam by sword or submission, demanding tribute from the infidels or forcing their conversion. His campaigns against the Persians sharpened his ambition, and his gaze turned westward, seeking to push his empire's borders deeper into Europe, both for faith and for power. Vengeance burned in the heart of King Francis, who eagerly reached out to Suleiman, urging him to strike at Charles's vulnerable eastern flank, forcing the emperor to loosen his grip on France's borders. Suleiman's march into Europe began with thunderous force in the summer of 1526, as Buda fell before him and Hungary bent to his will. John Zapolia, governor of Transylvania, was crowned king, a puppet ruling by Suleiman's favor. But Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria and King of Bohemia, challenged this claim, refusing to let Hungary slip from his grasp without bloodshed. As Suleiman fought in Persia in 1528, Hungary erupted into rebellion. Among the rebel banners, some swore allegiance to Ferdinand, ready to die for his cause in defiance of the Ottoman yoke. With Persia subdued for the moment, Suleiman's attention snapped back to Europe. He set his sights on Vienna, determined to crush Ferdinand in his own city and carve Austria, along with the Holy Roman Empire, into the Ottoman dominion. On April 10th, 1529, Suleiman unleashed his army from Constantinople, its banners darkening the sky. Ferdinand, learning of the storm heading his way, convened a desperate council in Bohemia, scrambling to muster troops. But Ferdinand's calls for reinforcements fell on deaf ears. Austria, Bohemia, and the empire made empty promises, yet sent few soldiers, leaving him woefully underprepared for the coming siege. Charles, entangled in Italian conflicts, was forced to split his gaze between the plotting Francis and the ever-defiant Pope Clement, unable to send aid to his embattled brother. In Vienna, the ancient walls, crumbling after 250 years, stood a mere 5 feet thick and were riddled with weak points. There was no time to reinforce them with stone, so defenders hastily filled the breaches with dirt and the rubble of razed suburbs, leveling the ground to prepare the fields of fire. Vienna's defense rested in the hands of Philip, Count Palatine of Austria, but alongside him stood two formidable warriors, Graf Nicholas Zusom Reiferscheidt, a master strategist, and the hardened William von Roggendorf. Graf Nicholas took command of the desperate preparations, directing the repair of the walls, stockpiling every scrap of food and ammunition, and driving out women and children to lighten the strain on dwindling resources. As the siege loomed, Nicholas meticulously positioned the city's artillery, 72 cannons of all sizes, their muzzles trained on the Ottoman horde that was soon to surround them. When the siege began, Vienna's garrison consisted of 22,000 hardened infantry and 2,000 cavalry, ready to die to defend their city from the unstoppable Islamic tide. By the time Suleiman's army reached Vienna on September 26, 1529, it had swollen to a terrifying mass. With reinforcements from his puppet king, John Zapolia, and countless camp followers, his force may have numbered 350,000 souls. Among them, 80,000 were seasoned Turkish warriors, alongside 6,000 Hungarians. The Ottoman advance was nothing short of a spectacle. The Janissaries surged up the Danube in boats, halting briefly at Buda with Suleiman to retake the city, where they butchered its defenders in a brutal display of power. Word of the massacre and the marauding Akinji, 20,000 ruthless raiders laying waste to the countryside, reached Vienna, spurring its defenders to fortify their battered walls with frantic haste. On September the 23rd, the first wave of Turks appeared on the horizon, clashing with Viennese cavalry in sharp skirmishes. By the 27th, the city was completely encircled, and Suleiman dispatched envoys to demand its immediate surrender. 4 captured cavalrymen, draped in opulent Turkish finery, were paraded before Vienna's walls as the Sultan's messengers. Suleiman's message was clear: surrender, and only a few officials would occupy the city. He would even have his morning meal there in 2 days' time. Resist, and Vienna would be erased from existence, leaving no trace for future generations to find. Graf Nicholas, now the city's de facto commander, sent back 4 Turkish prisoners, adorned in the richest attire. They carried no words of reply, for silence itself was the answer. Vienna would not yield. Vienna's fate was not solely in the hands of its defenders or Suleiman's army. It rested in the hands of nature. The summer of 1529 brought relentless rains, the heaviest in living memory, turning the roads to quagmires and stranding the vital Ottoman supply wagons far from the front. Worse still, Suleiman's prized siege artillery was trapped in the mud. He had brought only 300 smaller cannons, woefully insufficient to batter down even Vienna's ancient walls. Suleiman had but one option left: to undermine the city itself. His engineers set to work, digging tunnels beneath Vienna's defenses, packing them with gunpowder, and preparing to blast the walls from below. The mining began at once, but fortune smiled on the defenders when a deserter revealed the locations of the Turkish tunnels, giving them precious time to react. Vienna's defenders struck back by countermining, either digging beneath the Ottoman tunnels to collapse them, or meeting the Turks head-on underground. In the shadowy, suffocating depths, the Viennese fought with savage determination and emerged victorious in these hidden battles. Yet not all the mines could be thwarted. Some detonated with terrifying force, blasting open breaches wide enough for cavalry to charge through. But even these gaps proved futile, as the defenders fortified the ruins and repelled every assault. Behind the shattered walls, the defenders had prepared in grim silence, digging trenches and erecting wooden palisades to create a new line of defense. The stalwart pikemen, veterans of Europe's fiercest battles, held the breaches with unwavering resolve. Their pikes bristling like thorns, the Janissaries, swords in hand, found no room to maneuver in the tight quarters of this savage contest, their famed blades rendered useless against the disciplined ranks of pikes. On October the 12th, the fighting reached a bloody crescendo at one of the breaches. The Janissaries, hurling themselves into the fray, were met with unbreakable resistance. By the day's end, 1,200 of Suleiman's elite lay dead in the dirt, their bodies a testament to the ferocity of Vienna's defenders. That night, under a moonless sky on October 12th, Suleiman gathered his generals for a council of war. The situation had become dire. His supply wagons were hopelessly mired in the mud, and the ravaged countryside could no longer sustain his starving forces. Vienna, which he had expected to crush swiftly, stood defiant, tougher than he had ever imagined. Winter's chill loomed on the horizon, and with it the grim reality of the siege set in. The defenders had repelled every attack, holding each breach with tenacity. Suleiman's losses had mounted to a staggering 14,000 to 20,000 men, with most of the dead being his prized Janissaries and noble cavalry, sacrificed thus far in vain. For the first time in 2 centuries, the Janissaries whose lives had been shaped by duty and sacrifice, began to grumble. The unbreakable warriors of legend, who had never questioned their fate, now saw themselves as pawns, being senselessly thrown into the jaws of death. Suleiman, desperate to rekindle their fire, promised them vast rewards, more gold than they had ever seen, for one final all-out assault. On October the 14th, another mine detonated, its explosion thundering through the city, but the wall, instead of crumbling inward, collapsed outward in a massive heap of rubble, blocking the breach and sealing off any hope of a swift Ottoman charge. The Janissaries, undeterred, hurled themselves at the defenses. Yet again, the disciplined pikemen stood immovable, their pikes forming an impenetrable wall. The attackers, despite their fury, were beaten back in defeat once more. That night, the Ottoman camp, a sprawling sea of tents that had once covered the plains around Vienna, was dismantled. Suleiman's soldiers, in a final act of defiance, set towering bonfires ablaze, burning everything they could not carry, and with grim cruelty, they cast their prisoners into the flames. The following morning, under a gray sky that began to snow, the Ottoman army withdrew. The dream of Vienna's conquest had melted away, leaving only a trail of dead and defeat in its wake. A mere handful of defenders had spared Western Europe from the iron grip of Islamic Ottoman conquest. Yet in the immediate aftermath, it seemed as though little had shifted. Jan Zapolya still reigned in Buda under Suleiman's banner, and Hungary remained an Ottoman province. 3 years later, Suleiman returned, determined to finish what he had begun, but the fierce resistance at the town of Guns, modern-day Kozeg, Austria, combined with a formidable European force under Charles V, forced him to retreat once more. Suleiman's gaze was then drawn eastward by another rebellion in Persia, prompting him to broker a peace with Ferdinand. His armies marched away from Europe, turning instead toward the Persian front. In 1541, Suleiman returned to Europe to reclaim Hungary from Ferdinand's invasion. He succeeded in retaking the territory, but did not push beyond it. Suleiman's reign marked the zenith of the Ottoman Empire, its power unmatched, its borders vast and unchallenged. With Suleiman's death, the line of great sultans came to an end. His son, Selim, known derisively as the Sot, lacked his father's vision and skill. Under Selim's rule, the Ottoman Empire began its long, slow decline, so much so that by the 19th century it had earned the ignoble title, the Sick Man of Europe. The First Siege of Vienna signaled the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's descent, yet the fire of ambition still burned in the hearts of later sultans, even as their power waned. In 1663, an Ottoman offensive was repelled at St. Gothard Abbey, a defeat that forced them to sign the Treaty of Vasvar, securing a 20-year truce while granting them control over Transylvania. The mastermind behind this collapse was Grand Vizier Ahmed Keuprili, who later presided over a string of Turkish defeats against both the Poles and the Russians during the mid-1770s. After him came Kara Mustafa, a man bereft of any real skill yet elevated by the Sultan's favor, a hunting companion, and rumor had it, perhaps something more. Kara Mustafa was a man consumed by greed, corruption, and insatiable bloodlust. He alone persuaded Sultan Mehmed to launch yet another assault on Vienna after the Treaty of Vasvar expired, though none shared his eagerness for the fight. Sultan Mehmed assembled an enormous force of 150 to 200,000 men and launched his campaign with a grand spectacle in Constantinople. Yet dark omens came swiftly as foul weather cast a shadow over the empire's march, feeding the superstitions of his followers. Much like the doomed campaign of 1529, this expedition carried scant siege artillery, though the Ottomans' firearms were now superior to the outdated weapons of Vienna's defenders. Inside Vienna, a mere 15,000 soldiers stood ready to defend the city, while its ancient walls, much like before, crumbled in disrepair, vulnerable to the might of the Ottoman horde. But Vienna's fate did not rest in its feeble walls. It lay in the arrogance of Kara Mustafa himself. In Mustafa's mind, Vienna's fall was inevitable. What mattered most was how it fell. His fortune depended not on victory alone, but on the spoils that followed. If Vienna was taken by storm, the plunder would belong to the troops. But if the city fell by starvation or surrender, the vast wealth of its coffers would flow directly into Mustafa's hands. So Mustafa delayed, refusing to press the siege, his greed blinding him to the danger. His hesitation bought Vienna precious time, allowing reinforcements to gather and race toward the beleaguered city. On September the 12th, 1683, after 7 brutal weeks of siege, a united force of Austrians, Germans, and Poles, led by the indomitable Polish king Jan Sobieski, descended upon Vienna's defenders like a long-awaited storm. Despite his overwhelming numbers, outnumbering the Europeans 3-1, Mustafa's army was shattered as the combined forces of Europe thundered down from the hills with unrelenting fury. By the end of that savage day, the Ottoman lines had broken, and Mustafa's once mighty army was in full retreat, fleeing from the field in disarray. For a brief moment, Mustafa managed to deceive Sultan Mehmed, shifting the blame for his catastrophic defeat. But when the truth emerged, he met his end with the silken cord of ritual strangulation, the final punishment for his hubris. Never again would the Ottoman Empire mount such a bold offensive. For the next 2.5 centuries, the empire endured only by gradually bleeding territory to its neighbors, its former glory a fading memory. Had Suleiman taken Vienna, he would have wintered in its heart, poised to unleash his armies into the German lands the following spring. A pact with France would have crushed the Holy Roman Empire between 2 relentless powers, squeezing it into submission. This scenario would have fulfilled France's ambition, at least in the short term. Yet the French king grossly overestimated his sway over the Sultan, unaware that Suleiman's vision far eclipsed his own. Had the pieces fallen differently, Islam might have triumphed over a fractured and divided Christendom, forever altering the course of European history. The Ottoman military had reached its apex, and the siege of Vienna marked the beginning of its long decline. The Janissaries, once thought invisible, had been broken. For the first time, their enemies knew they could be defeated, and worse, so did the Janissaries themselves. The bribes offered to them for their final, desperate assault proved that their fierce spirit, their legendary elan, had been irrevocably lost. Per McCarthy, quote, "The Janissaries themselves degenerated from the mighty force they had been. They used their power to improve their personal lives at the expense of the state." The Janissaries were turned into unruly Praetorian guards who made and unmade sultans. And this was perhaps inevitable, but even determinism must admit that Vienna started them down the long slide. End quote. The Janissaries, once the hammer of Ottoman expansion, now became the empire's greatest source of internal discord and instability. After Suleiman, the brilliance of Ottoman leadership dimmed, worsened by the very success of previous sultans. By the mid-16th century, the empire had grown so vast that it could no longer be effectively ruled from the central authority in Constantinople. Though the empire's reach was defined by how far an army could march from Constantinople in a single campaign season, it remained too vast and unwieldy for imperial rule to maintain a tight grip. With the Holy Roman Empire and Persia as their chief rivals, the Ottomans could muster only 2 fully equipped armies to maintain control over their sprawling domains. Raising more armies would have drained the empire's coffers and further eroded the quality of its forces, particularly as the once elite Janissaries continued their downward spiral. The Ottoman Empire had reached its limit of its expansion, conquest, and plunder, once the lifeblood of its economy could no longer sustain the empire as its borders remained fixed. As the next century unfolded, the empire grappled with rising unemployment and rampant banditry, problems the faltering Ottoman government proved powerless to contain. Vienna had marked a turning point in the Ottoman Empire's fate, at the very moment when a strong and visionary leader was desperately needed to hold or expand its vast territories. The empire's well of talent had run dry.